In 1968, the man who built the computer that forced IBM into court was in a basement in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, wiring its successor alone. Control Data Corporation had just won the biggest antitrust settlement in history against the most powerful technology company on Earth, and the engineer who made it possible had already walked out. Seymour Cray worked under a single bulb while a winter wind pressed against the ground-level window. The room smelled of rosin and heated wire. He was 42 years old, soldering the first connections of what would become the fastest machine ever built. The machine that triggered the lawsuit was the CDC 6600, the first computer widely called a supercomputer, and it broke IBM's stranglehold on large-scale computing so completely that the government sued IBM for monopolistic practices. Control Data joined that case, fought for 5 years, and won a settlement worth hundreds of millions of dollars, plus IBM's entire punched card subsidiary. The victory should have secured the company's future. Instead, Cray was gone before the check cleared, wiring a new machine in a hollowed-out house with no team and no corporate campus. He chose Chippewa Falls for a reason that had nothing to do with isolation. The shorter the signal path, the faster the calculation. At the clock rates he was chasing, a wire traveling 3 feet could destroy a machine. The town sat 85 miles from Minneapolis, where the boardroom decisions happened, and a universe away from the glass towers of Armonk, New York, where IBM decided which companies lived and which did not. Cray had concluded something that his former employer refused to accept. The next generation of computing could only be designed by one mind, with no interference, inside a box so compact that its physical shape was part of its speed. Control Data called that insanity. The machine on his bench would ship in 1976 as the Cray 1, an elegant C-shaped tower of cooling freon and 100,000 hand-wired gates performing 160 million floating-point operations per second. It cost $8 million. National laboratories bought it. Nuclear weapons designers bought it. Code breakers and weather modelers bought it, because nothing else could touch what he had built. The company he founded around that bench, Cray Research, would make his surname synonymous with a word the industry invented to describe what he was making: supercomputer. But the machine was still years from delivery in 1968, and the corporation Cray left behind was already unraveling from forces no settlement could fix. How does a company win hundreds of millions of dollars and a competitor's entire division, then collapse before the decade ends? What did Cray see in the physics of a wire that the engineers in Minneapolis missed? And why did Control Data, sitting on the bottleneck for every next-generation machine, hand the entire future to the man who abandoned them?
The question is not whether the Cray 1 worked.
Go look at the machine that wired the Cold War, and then ask yourself, if the company that beat IBM held all the cards, why was Seymour Cray soldering alone? So the story is not simply that a genius built the fastest computers on Earth from a basement in rural Wisconsin, though that is part of it. The larger story, the stranger one, is how the company that first beat IBM at its own game controlled the bottleneck for every next-generation machine and folded before the decade ended. The man who wired that first Cray 1 walked out once, and then he would walk out again. Each time, he was carrying the architecture of the next era. The question that hangs over the whole rise and fall is this: what happens when the person who sees around the next corner is the one person the rest of the company cannot keep? It is May 15th, 1957, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A group of engineers gather in a rented office above a radiator shop, the smell of hot metal and solvent rising through the floorboards. They have just resigned from Engineering Research Associates, a firm that built code-breaking machines for the Navy, and they have $600,000 in venture backing, money raised by selling shares to a handful of Midwestern insurance companies willing to bet on electronic computers. On the wall is a hand-drawn organizational chart, The new company will be called Control Data Corporation. Its first target is the market for large-scale scientific computing. Its competition is a company that in 1957 controls roughly 85% of the computer industry, International Business Machines. IBM was not merely dominant. IBM owned the stack. It sold the machines, the punched cards, the printers, the service contracts. It leased its systems rather than selling them outright, creating a recurring revenue stream no competitor could match. If a customer wanted a faster computer, IBM had one ready, and it would bundle the upgrade into a lease extension that made leaving nearly impossible. The Department of Justice had already opened one antitrust investigation into IBM in 1952, but that suit ended in a consent decree. By 1957, IBM was larger, more entrenched, and more willing to use its weight. Control Data's founders understood the physics of what they were attempting. They needed to build a machine fast enough to make the switch cost worthwhile. In 1960, they shipped the CDC 1604, a fully transistorized computer designed by a quiet engineer named Seymour Cray. It was faster than anything IBM sold. It was not an imitation. It was a different architecture altogether. And then, in 1964, Cray delivered the CDC 6600, 10 times faster than any IBM machine on the market. IBM's chairman, Thomas Watson Jr., wrote an internal memo asking how a company of 34 people could beat an operation with thousands of engineers. He did not like the answer. The revenue gap between the two companies that year belongs inside this scene. Control Data's 1964 revenue was $160 million against IBM's $3.2 billion, 20 to 1. Yet the smaller company had the faster machine. Cray had proven it could be done. The question now was whether it could be sustained. Because the man who built the architecture was already restless. He wanted fewer transistors and a different kind of quiet, the kind that came from distance, from separation, from a town where no one would interrupt him with a committee. He had already decided that Minneapolis was too loud, and not in any way that had to do with noise. Subscribe now. Because what comes next is the antitrust fight that gave Control Data everything it asked for, and a founder who walked away before the check arrived. In October 1964, Seymour Cray did something that made no sense to the people signing his paychecks. He told Control Data's CEO, William Norris, that he wanted to leave Minneapolis, move to a small town in Wisconsin, and design the next machine in near total isolation. No management layers. No design by committee. One man, one room, one architecture. Norris understood Cray well enough to say yes. Control Data opened a laboratory in Chippewa Falls, 40 miles from headquarters, staffed by Cray and a handful of engineers he trusted. The arrangement was almost unheard of in corporate America. A company fighting for its life against IBM had just let its most valuable mind walk into the woods. The doubt deserves its moment. The obvious objection is that Cray was a prima donna demanding special treatment, and that Norris's decision fractured the company. The record complicates that. By 1964, Cray's working methods were not a mystery. He designed alone. He built incrementally. He refused to repeat himself. The CDC 6600 had proven the model: a small team, a relentless focus on speed, and zero tolerance for the design by politics that slowed IBM's machines to a crawl. Keeping Cray inside the Minneapolis building, surrounded by managers who wanted roadmaps and trade-off meetings, was a guarantee he would leave. Norris chose the risk of distance over the certainty of loss. The Chippewa Falls lab produced the CDC 6600's follow-on, the CDC 7600, which shipped in 1969 and ran at 36 megahertz, roughly 4 times the speed of its predecessor. It was the fastest machine anyone could buy. It also contained a problem nobody yet recognized. The architecture was approaching a physical wall. Cray knew it. He wanted to build the next generation around integrated circuits and a radically compact design, a cylindrical machine cooled by liquid freon that would make the 7600 look like a filing cabinet. Norris said no. Control Data was deep in the antitrust litigation against IBM, burning cash, and the 7600 was still new. The board could not fund another architecture before the last one had recouped its costs. Cray left in 1972. He founded Cray Research and designed the machine the company had refused. The machines are still running. Not in museums, not wrapped in plastic inside a warehouse. In the secure basements of weather agencies, weapons laboratories, and intelligence centers, Cray-designed processors continue to calculate faster than the heat can destroy them, exactly what Seymour Cray wired them to do back in 1968. Chippewa Falls still has the building. The sign came down long ago. The name migrated through a string of acquisitions. Silicon Graphics bought Cray Research in 1996, sold it to Terra Computer Company in 2000, and Terra renamed itself Cray Inc. and kept building supercomputers until Hewlett-Packard Enterprise absorbed the shell in 2019. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. The name has nothing to do with Chippewa Falls, or a single bare light bulb over a workbench, or winter wind coming through a ground-level window. It is a name that acquires other names. But the machines deployed across the field still boot. The architecture Cray designed, vector processing, the fanatical reduction of wire length, memory paths so tight they practically touch the silicon, survives inside the DNA of systems that model climate collapse and simulate nuclear stockpiles and hunt for exoplanets. So what did the settlement actually buy? It delivered the Service Bureau Corporation, IBM's data processing arm, and a cash award of hundreds of millions of dollars that kept the company solvent while the industry shifted under its feet. But the deal arrived carrying the one question Control Data could not answer. The man who had built the machines that forced IBM to the table was gone. The box he had begged them to fund, small, cylindrical, cooled by liquid freon, a machine so fast it would make the 7600 look like a filing cabinet, was sitting on a bench in Wisconsin under someone else's control. Control Data had the money, the subsidiary, and the settlement. It did not have the next architecture. You can trace the diaspora. Cray left in 1972 and built the Cray 1. Steve Chen, one of his senior designers, departed Cray Research in 1987 and started Supercomputer Systems Incorporated, taking a generation of vector processing expertise with him. Burton Smith, another architect shaped inside Cray's orbit, built the Terra MTA, a machine so radical in its approach to parallelism that the rest of the industry needed 2 decades to catch up. The engineers who hand-wired the 6600 and the 7600 and the Cray 1 did not evaporate when the company changed hands. They fanned outward into laboratories, startups, and government agencies that still required the single thing Cray had proved could be manufactured, a computer whose physical shape was inseparable from its speed. Control Data endured into the 1990s as a diminished entity. It sold its disk drive business to Seagate. It spun off its services arm. In 1992, the corporation dissolved. William Norris, the CEO who had backed Cray when no other executive would risk it, lived another 14 years past the company he built. He died in 2006 at 95. The settlement gave Control Data everything a corporation can ask for: capital, assets, market access, and none of it replaced the man in the basement, working by the light of one bulb. The story does not terminate with a bankruptcy filing. It terminates with a collection of ideas that escaped the company that paid for them and kept running under other people's names. You can trace the diaspora. Cray left in 1972 and built the Cray 1. Steve Chen, one of his senior designers, departed Cray Research in 1987 and started Supercomputer Systems Incorporated, taking a generation of vector processing expertise with him. Burton Smith, another architect shaped inside Cray's orbit, built the Terra MTA, a machine so radical in its approach to parallelism that the rest of the industry needed 2 decades to catch up. The engineers who hand-wired the 6600 and the 7600 and the Cray 1 did not evaporate when the company changed hands. They fanned outward into laboratories, startups, and government agencies that still required the single thing Cray had proved could be manufactured, a computer whose physical shape was inseparable from its speed. Control Data endured into the 1990s as a diminished entity. It sold its disk drive business to Seagate. It spun off its services arm. In 1992, the corporation dissolved. William Norris, the CEO who had backed Cray when no other executive would risk it, lived another 14 years past the company he built. He died in 2006 at 95. The settlement gave Control Data everything a corporation can ask for: capital, assets, market access, and none of it replaced the man in the basement working by the light of one bulb. The story does not terminate with a bankruptcy filing. It terminates with a collection of ideas that escaped the company that paid for them and kept running under other people's names.